This arrogant billionaire just threw a menu at his waitress, mocking her for being functionally illiterate. Little does he know, she's the only person in this room who spotted the billion-dollar loophole that's about to destroy his entire legacy. Watch closely, because how this simple waitress turns his insults into the ultimate legal takedown will leave you breathless. The fastest way to reveal a person's character is to give them an audience and watch who they choose to humiliate. At 40 years old, Adrian Cole had become one of the most respected chief executive officers in the country. Financial magazines praised his instincts. Business networks followed his every move. Investors treated his predictions like forecasts of the future. Tonight, he sat at the center of a private dining room in one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, preparing to finalize the largest merger of his career. The deal was worth billions of dollars and would place his company in an entirely new league. Around the polished table sat board members, senior executives, attorneys, and strategic partners, all eager to remain in Adrian's good graces. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light overhead while quiet jazz drifted through the restaurant. Every few minutes, someone complimented Adrian's leadership, his vision, or his ability to close impossible deals. He accepted the praise as naturally as breathing. To him, success was proof that he belonged above ordinary people. Across the room, 27-year-old Emily Carter moved between tables with practiced efficiency. She carried herself with calm professionalism, greeting guests with a warm smile and solving problems before they became complaints. Most customers barely noticed her. Adrian noticed her only when something went wrong. The restaurant had recently introduced a new digital menu system that required customers to scan a QR code with their phones. Unfortunately, the signal inside the private dining area was unusually weak that evening. Several guests at Adrian's table struggled to access the menu. Emily quickly approached to help, apologizing for the inconvenience while attempting to refresh the system. One guest laughed and blamed technology. Another patiently waited. Adrian saw an opportunity. Leaning back in his chair, he spoke loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear. "Maybe the problem isn't the technology," he said with a smirk. "Maybe the instructions were too complicated." A few guests chuckled. Emily remained polite. "I apologize, sir. We are experiencing a temporary connection issue. I will have it resolved in just a moment." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "You're sure you read the instructions correctly?" More laughter followed. These days they make everything simple. Scan, tap, read. Although I suppose reading is not everyone's specialty. Several people laughed harder than the joke deserved. As Emily calmly presented the printed paper menus as a backup, Adrian wasn't finished. He scoffed, tapping his finger aggressively on a complex, French-termed culinary description at the bottom of the page. "Tell me, sweetheart," Adrian sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "Can you even read these specials? Or do I need to spell them out for you? It's embarrassing that this establishment hires people who are practically functionally illiterate to serve high-profile guests." A heavy silence fell over the table. Emily felt the sting of the cruel remark, but her expression remained completely professional. "I assure you, sir, I can read the menu perfectly. I will give your group a few minutes to decide." She bowed slightly and walked away, leaving Adrian to soak in the sycophantic laughter of his board members. Her calm response only encouraged Adrian. "See? Problem solved. Paper menus. Sometimes old-fashioned methods are best." The guests rewarded him with more laughter, and the conversation moved on as if nothing had happened. Emily quietly delivered the printed menus and continued serving the table with the same professionalism she showed every guest. An hour later, the dinner shifted from celebration to business. Adrian's phone vibrated with an urgent call from his lead counsel regarding final merger documents. His expression changed immediately. The room grew serious. After a brief conversation, he informed the group that several legal details required immediate review. One of the partners suggested moving to the executive conference suite attached to the restaurant, where they could review the final merger documents in a more secure setting. Everyone agreed. Chairs slid back. Briefcases were gathered. Conversations resumed as the group moved toward the secured meeting space. In the rush to collect stacks of reports, contracts, and financial projections, nobody noticed that several loose pages from a legal appendix slipped free from a document folder and disappeared beneath the table. Minutes later, After the powerful group had left the dining room, Emily returned to clear the table and noticed a corner of paper peeking out from beneath a chair. Emily crouched beside the chair and carefully pulled the loose pages into the light. At first glance, they looked like ordinary business documents, the kind corporate clients left behind from time to time. She intended to gather them and immediately bring them to the restaurant manager so they could be returned to their owner. As she straightened the stack, however, a bold heading near the top of the first page caught her attention. The language was unmistakably legal. Even after years away from the classroom, certain phrases still stood out to her the way familiar landmarks stood out on a long-forgotten road. She paused for only a second before reminding herself that these papers were not her business. Still, she needed to make sure the pages belonged together before returning them. As she aligned the corners, her eyes briefly passed over a subsection title concerning merger termination obligations. Something about the wording felt unusual. Emily frowned. The sentence structure itself was not incorrect, but there was an inconsistency she could not immediately identify. She tried to ignore it and continue her work, yet the feeling lingered. It was the same feeling she used to experience during law school, when a professor presented a case that appeared straightforward on the surface but concealed a flaw beneath layers of technical language. Years earlier, Emily had been one of the most promising students in her class. Professors had praised her analytical ability. Recruiters from prestigious firms had shown interest in her future. She had dreamed of becoming a corporate attorney, negotiating complex agreements, and protecting clients from costly mistakes. Then life had intervened. Her father's unexpected financial collapse had left the family overwhelmed with debt. Medical expenses followed. Tuition became impossible to justify. While many of her classmates continued toward successful legal careers, Emily stepped away from school and entered the workforce to help keep her family afloat. The dream never completely disappeared. It simply moved into the background of her life. Now, standing beside an empty table in an upscale restaurant, she felt those dormant skills quietly awaken. She looked at the page once more. This time she focused on the specific clause that had unsettled her. The more she read, the more her concern grew. The termination fee provision appeared to assign financial responsibility under one set of conditions, while a related liability clause several paragraphs later appeared to transfer that same responsibility under a different set of circumstances. Independently, each provision seemed reasonable. Together, they created a dangerous contradiction. Emily slowly turned to the next page. The conflict became even clearer. If the agreement were executed exactly as written, an aggressive counterparty could potentially exploit the language and shift an enormous financial burden onto Adrian Cole's company. She blinked and reviewed the text again, convinced she must have overlooked something. Large firms employed teams of attorneys precisely to prevent mistakes like this. Yet every time she traced the logic from one clause to the next, she reached the same conclusion. The exposure was staggering. Her pulse quickened. For a moment, she wondered whether she was misunderstanding the broader context. She reread the relevant sections carefully, line by line. The flaw remained. Emily exhaled slowly and looked toward the hallway leading to the VIP conference rooms where Adrian and his associates were still meeting. Part of her wanted to walk away and let the professionals handle their own problems. After all, the man had publicly mocked her less than an hour earlier. But another part of her knew that remaining silent would mean ignoring a mistake that could have consequences measured not in thousands or millions, but in billions. Reaching into her apron pocket, she removed a small notepad used for customer orders and wrote down the clause numbers along with a brief explanation of the contradiction. She never touched the original wording and never marked the documents themselves. When she finished, she stared at the note in her hand, uncertain whether warning Adrian Cole would be the smartest decision she had made all night or the worst. Emily slipped the notepad back into her apron and gathered the loose pages carefully. For several moments, she remained frozen beside the empty table, debating whether to get involved at all. The simplest option would be to hand the documents to the manager, return to work, and forget everything she had seen. Nobody expected legal analysis from a waitress. Nobody had asked for her opinion. Most importantly, nobody in Adrian Cole's circle seemed interested in hearing it. Yet the contradiction in the merger language refused to leave her mind. She had reviewed the clauses 3 separate times and reached the same conclusion every time. If the agreement moved forward without correction, the termination provisions could trigger a chain of liability that appeared completely inconsistent with the protections the company clearly intended to create. Emily had spent enough time studying corporate law to recognize the danger. The amount at stake was almost impossible to comprehend. She glanced toward the hallway leading to the VIP conference room. The meeting was still underway. Through the closed doors, she could occasionally hear muffled voices, followed by long periods of silence. They were obviously deep in negotiations. A reasonable person would probably avoid interrupting them. Then again, a reasonable legal team should have noticed the problem before the document ever reached the final stage. Emily carried the pages to the restaurant manager and explained that they appeared to belong to the group meeting in the conference room. The manager thanked her and prepared to return them immediately. Emily hesitated. "There is something else," she said carefully. "I think there may be an issue with one of the clauses." The manager blinked in confusion. "A legal issue?" Emily nodded. "Possibly." The manager gave a polite smile that suggested he did not know what to do with that information. "Those people have an entire team of attorneys," he replied. "I'm sure they have it covered." Under normal circumstances, Emily would have agreed. Tonight, however, uncertainty lingered. "Maybe," she said quietly. "But if I am right, it is a serious problem." Before the manager could respond, the conference room door opened. One of Adrian's associates stepped into the hallway while speaking on his phone. The expression on his face suggested the meeting was becoming increasingly tense. Moments later, another executive emerged carrying additional folders and requesting fresh coffee for the room. The atmosphere no longer resembled a celebratory business dinner. It felt more like a high-pressure negotiation approaching a deadline. Emily watched the activity and made a decision. She removed the small note from her apron pocket and added one final sentence beneath the clause references. She kept the wording brief, professional, and factual. There were no assumptions and no dramatic predictions. Just a concise explanation of the apparent contradiction and the potential exposure it created. After reading it one final time, she folded the note and placed it between the recovered pages. If she was wrong, the attorneys would dismiss it in seconds. If she was right, someone needed to know before signatures touched paper. Her manager sighed and reluctantly agreed to deliver the documents. As he walked toward the conference room, Emily returned to her duties, telling herself she had done all she reasonably could. Still, an uneasy feeling lingered in the back of her mind. The next few minutes would determine whether she was hopelessly out of her depth or the only person who had noticed a $3 billion mistake hiding in plain sight. Nearly 15 minutes passed before Emily saw the conference room door open again. She was carrying a tray of drinks across the dining area when the restaurant manager appeared in the hallway. His expression immediately told her something had happened. He looked uneasy, as though he regretted delivering the note in the first place. Before Emily could ask a question, Adrian Cole stepped out behind him. The confidence he had displayed throughout the evening was still present, but now it was mixed with visible irritation. Several executives followed close behind. Their attention was fixed entirely on Emily. Guests at nearby tables sensed the tension and quietly returned to their conversations. Adrian walked directly toward her. "Was that your note?" he asked. His voice was controlled, but there was no mistaking the annoyance underneath it. Emily set the tray down carefully. "Yes, sir." Adrian held up the folded paper between two fingers. "You are telling me that after serving drinks for an hour, you somehow discovered a flaw in a merger agreement reviewed by some of the most expensive attorneys in the country?" Emily remained calm. "I am saying there appears to be a contradiction between two clauses." One of the executives shook his head and laughed. "This is unbelievable." Another muttered something about people overestimating their expertise after reading a few articles online. Adrian glanced at them before returning his attention to Emily. "Do you understand how confidential these documents are?" he asked. "I understand that the pages were accidentally left behind and that I returned them immediately," Emily replied. "I also understand that if the language means what I believe it means, someone should look at it before the agreement is finalized." Adrian folded his arms. "And what exactly qualifies you to make that judgment?" The question carried the same dismissive tone he had used earlier when mocking her over the QR code system. Emily noticed several people waiting for her to stumble over the answer. "I studied corporate law before leaving school for family reasons," she said. "I am not claiming to know everything." I am simply suggesting the clauses deserve another review. A brief silence followed. Adrian looked unconvinced. You expect me to believe that a waitress discovered a problem my legal team missed? Emily did not react to the insult. No, sir. I expect you to verify whether I am wrong. The simplicity of her answer seemed to frustrate him even more. One of the board members stepped forward. What exactly is the issue? Emily hesitated. She had no desire to discuss private legal matters in a public hallway. Adrian noticed her hesitation and interpreted it as uncertainty. That is what I thought, he said. You found a few legal terms and convinced yourself you uncovered some hidden disaster. Several executives nodded in agreement. Emily took a slow breath. The termination fee provision in the appendix creates an unlimited liability loophole. Section 8.4 was clearly designed to cap your losses, but the wording here completely bypasses that cap, making your company legally responsible for the counterparty's entire debt. If you sign this, you are walking straight into a multi-billion-dollar trap. The reaction was immediate. Some executives looked confused. Others exchanged uncertain glances. Adrian opened his mouth to dismiss her explanation, but before he could speak, a voice echoed from inside the conference room. Adrian, you need to hear this. Everyone turned toward the open doorway as the company's lead attorney stepped into the hall holding the recovered pages in his hand. The expression on his face was no longer irritated. It was deeply concerned. The hallway fell silent. Moments earlier, most of the executives had been treating Emily's observation as an amusing distraction. Now every eye shifted toward the lead attorney standing in the conference room doorway. The man rarely displayed emotion during negotiations. His reputation had been built on composure and precision. The concern on his face immediately changed the atmosphere. Adrian turned toward him. What is it? He asked. The attorney glanced briefly at Emily before looking back at his client. I reviewed the section she referenced. Adrian let out a short laugh. And the attorney did not laugh with him. We need to discuss this immediately. Several board members exchanged uneasy looks. Adrian's confidence remained intact, but a small crack had begun to appear beneath the surface. You cannot be serious, he said. You are telling me this entire situation started because a waitress read 2 pages and suddenly discovered something your team missed? The attorney took a measured breath. I am telling you that her concern is legitimate. The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Nobody spoke for several seconds. One executive actually blinked as if he thought he had misheard. Adrian stared at his attorney. Legitimate does not mean significant. Normally, I would agree, the attorney replied. Unfortunately, this appears to be significant. The board members immediately moved closer. One of the senior partners stepped forward. How significant? The attorney looked down at the documents. The termination fee language and the liability allocation language create a conflict. If the agreement is executed in its current form, opposing counsel could argue that our protections become unenforceable under certain triggering events. A wave of confusion spread through the group. The legal terminology was familiar, but the implications were not. Adrian folded his arms. Speak English. The attorney hesitated before answering. If the wrong circumstances occur after closing, your company could become responsible for obligations that were never intended to be yours. How much exposure are we talking about? Asked a board member. The attorney looked directly at Adrian. Potentially several $billion. The hallway became completely silent again. Even the restaurant staff standing nearby stopped moving. Adrian's expression hardened. That is impossible. I thought so too, the attorney admitted. That is why I reviewed the language 3 times. He held up the recovered pages. The contradiction is real. Adrian immediately reached for the documents and began reading. The confidence that had carried him through the evening slowly faded as he moved from one clause to another. He read the same paragraph twice, then a third time. For the first time all night, he was not the smartest person in the conversation. The realization visibly unsettled him. One executive looked toward Emily. How did you even notice this? She answered honestly. The language felt inconsistent. Another executive shook his head in disbelief. Our outside counsel reviewed this. Internal counsel reviewed this. The other company's attorneys reviewed this. Emily remained quiet. She had no interest in embarrassing anyone. The lead attorney continued studying the note she had written. What concerns me most, he said slowly, is that she identified the exact conflict without access to the full agreement. Adrian lowered the papers. His eyes settled on Emily. The arrogance that had fueled his earlier mockery was still present, but now it was competing with something unfamiliar. Doubt. For the first time that evening, he was no longer looking at her as a waitress. He was looking at her as the person who might have just saved his company from a catastrophic mistake. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The energy in the hallway had shifted so completely that it almost felt like a different evening. Earlier, Emily had stood there as an employee being quietly ridiculed by powerful people. Now those same people were staring at her, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. Adrian looked down at the pages again before turning toward his lead attorney. "Walk me through it," he said. The attorney nodded. "I already started reviewing the language with the team inside. The problem is not in either clause individually. The problem appears when they are interpreted together." One of the board members frowned. "Then why did nobody catch it?" The attorney gave an uncomfortable smile. "Because each review was focused on separate sections. Everyone assumed the provisions were consistent with one another." He glanced at Emily. She did not make that assumption. Adrian remained silent. The attorney then surprised everyone by addressing Emily directly. "Would you mind explaining how you spotted it?" Several executives immediately looked skeptical. One of them opened his mouth as if to object, then stopped himself. Emily hesitated. She was standing in a restaurant hallway wearing an apron while being asked legal questions by people who managed billion-dollar transactions. The situation felt surreal. "I can try," she said carefully. The attorney nodded. "Please." Emily took a slow breath. The termination fee language assumes liability ends once certain conditions are met. But Section 8.4 creates an exception that reactivates responsibility under a broader definition of related obligations. The two provisions are written as if they belong to different versions of the agreement. The attorney's eyebrows rose slightly. "Exactly." Several executives exchanged confused looks. Emily continued. "If opposing counsel ever challenged the interpretation, they could argue that the broader definition controls. That would transfer obligations back to your company." A board member immediately turned toward the attorney. "Is that accurate?" "Unfortunately, yes," he replied. The answer sent another wave of silence through the group. Adrian stared at Emily. The confidence in her voice was not arrogance. It was familiarity. She sounded like someone discussing a subject she genuinely understood. The attorney asked another question. "What made you focus on that specific inconsistency?" Emily answered without hesitation. "Because the liability language uses a different trigger threshold than the termination provision. When I saw that, I assumed it was a drafting error." The attorney slowly nodded. "That was my conclusion as well." The reaction among the executives was impossible to miss. Earlier they had dismissed her because of her uniform. Now they were watching a legal discussion unfold at a level many of them struggled to follow. Adrian finally broke the silence. "How much time would we have had before this became a problem?" The attorney considered the question. "Possibly none. The signing is scheduled for tomorrow morning." One board member exhaled sharply. Another shook his head. "So we were hours away?" "Yes," the attorney replied. "Hours away." Adrian lowered his eyes for a moment. For the first time all evening, there was no joke, no sarcastic remark, and no attempt to dominate the conversation. The reality of what had almost happened was becoming impossible to ignore. Then the attorney looked at Emily once more and asked a question nobody expected. "If you had access to the complete agreement, do you think you could help us identify whether there are any related conflicts?" The hallway fell silent again. This time, however, the silence was not caused by doubt. It was caused by the realization that the waitress they had underestimated might understand the document better than anyone in the room. Emily was not sure which surprised her more, the question itself or the fact that everyone appeared to be waiting for her answer. Just an hour earlier, most of these people had barely acknowledged her existence. Now a room full of executives, attorneys, and board members was looking at her with genuine interest. She chose her words carefully. "I would not be comfortable making assumptions based on only a few pages," she said. "But if there is one conflict, there is always a possibility that similar drafting inconsistencies exist elsewhere." The lead attorney nodded slowly. "That is exactly what concerns me." Adrian remained silent for several moments. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the conference room. "Come inside." Several executives looked startled by the invitation, but nobody objected. Emily hesitated. I am supposed to be working. The restaurant manager, who had been observing the entire exchange with growing disbelief, immediately spoke up. Do not worry about that. We will cover your tables. Emily glanced between the manager and the group before finally following them into the private conference room. The atmosphere inside was completely different from the dining area. The large table was covered with contracts, financial projections, laptops, and handwritten notes. A massive screen displayed sections of the merger agreement. Only an hour earlier, Emily would never have imagined herself sitting among these people. Yet as she took a seat near the end of the table, something unexpected happened. The intimidation slowly faded. The language on the screen was familiar. The structure of the agreement was familiar. The analytical process was familiar. For the first time that evening, she felt as though she had stepped back into a world she once believed she had lost forever. The lead attorney projected the relevant sections onto the screen. Show us exactly where your concern begins, he said. Emily studied the text. She pointed toward a paragraph buried deep within the agreement. The problem starts here, she explained. This definition expands the scope of responsibility beyond what the earlier provisions anticipate. One attorney immediately challenged the interpretation. Emily calmly walked through the language sentence by sentence. Another attorney raised a different objection. Again, she answered without hesitation. The discussion continued for nearly 30 minutes. With every question, Emily became more confident. She was not trying to impress anyone. She was simply analyzing the document the way she had been trained to do years ago. Gradually, the resistance around the table disappeared. The attorneys stopped challenging her conclusions and began building on them. Board members who had looked skeptical in the hallway were now taking notes. One executive quietly admitted that he had never fully understood several sections until Emily explained them in plain language. Even Adrian found himself listening more than speaking. He watched as the woman he had mocked for supposedly struggling with a menu dissected one of the most important agreements of his career with remarkable precision. Eventually, the lead attorney leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. I think we need to acknowledge something, he said. The room turned toward him. She is correct. No one argued. The evidence on the screen was impossible to ignore. The attorney then looked directly at Emily. Where did you study? The question seemed simple, yet it carried genuine respect. Emily lowered her eyes briefly before answering. Columbia Law School. Several people exchanged surprised looks. One board member actually sat forward in his chair. The attorney blinked. Columbia? Emily nodded. I was near the top of my class before I left. For a moment, nobody seemed sure how to respond. Earlier that evening, they had assumed she struggled to navigate a digital menu. Now they were learning she had once been one of the strongest students at one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. The room remained quiet long after Emily mentioned Columbia Law School. The reaction had nothing to do with prestige alone. It was the contrast that stunned them. Moments earlier, most of the people around the table had viewed her through the narrow lens of her current job. Now they were being forced to confront a reality that did not fit their assumptions. Adrian was the first to speak. Why did you leave? His tone was noticeably different from the one he had used throughout the evening. There was no sarcasm in it, only curiosity. Emily glanced at the documents spread across the table before answering. My father lost his business during a difficult period. Shortly afterward, my mother became ill. Tuition was not the priority anymore. My family needed help immediately. Nobody interrupted. I planned to return one day, she continued. At first I thought it would be temporary. Then 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. The lead attorney slowly nodded. He had seen similar stories before, but rarely from someone with Emily's level of analytical ability. Adrian leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, he found himself reflecting on how quickly he had judged her. Earlier, he had assumed her uniform told him everything he needed to know. Now that assumption felt embarrassingly shallow. One of the board members broke the silence. You realize you may have saved this transaction. Emily offered a small smile. Your legal team will save the transaction. I only pointed out a problem. The lead attorney laughed softly. That is a very generous interpretation of what happened tonight. Several people around the table agreed. Over the next hour, the group continued reviewing the agreement. Emily identified 2 additional areas where language inconsistencies could create unnecessary risk. Neither issue was as serious as the first discovery, but both required correction before signing. Earlier that evening, Several people had laughed when Adrian questioned her ability to read. Now those same people were quietly taking notes as she explained a contract worth billions of dollars. By the time the review concluded, the atmosphere in the room had changed completely. The executives who had once questioned her qualifications were now asking for her opinion before moving forward. Shortly before midnight, the lead attorney closed the final document and exhaled with relief. "I think we are finally secure." A ripple of satisfaction moved through the room. Months of negotiations had nearly been undermined by a drafting conflict nobody noticed. Adrian looked across the table at Emily. "I owe you an apology." Every conversation stopped. Adrian was not known for admitting mistakes. "Earlier tonight, I made assumptions about you that were unfair and disrespectful," he said. "I judged your intelligence based entirely on your job. I was wrong." Emily studied him carefully. The apology appeared genuine. "Thank you," she replied. Adrian nodded. "And I owe you far more than an apology." He opened a folder and wrote a number on a sheet of paper before sliding it across the table. Several executives immediately recognized it as a substantial consulting fee. Emily looked at the figure and then looked back at Adrian. "That is very generous." "It is appropriate," Adrian replied. "Your insight protected a deal worth billions." Emily remained silent for a moment. Then she surprised everyone once again. "If you truly want to thank me, there is something else I would like you to consider." Adrian raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" Emily glanced toward the restaurant outside the conference room. "The people working here spend every day being overlooked. Many of them are supporting families, paying for school, or working multiple jobs. If you are willing to invest in solutions, I would rather see some of that generosity create opportunities for people who rarely receive them." The request caught the entire room off guard. She had been handed leverage that most people would use entirely for themselves. Instead, she was thinking about others. For the second time that night, Adrian found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the woman sitting across from him. The conference room remained quiet after Emily made her request. Several executives exchanged surprised glances. They had expected her to negotiate a larger payment, demand a position within the company, or use the moment to advance her own career. Instead, she had chosen to speak on behalf of people who were not even in the room. Adrian studied her for a long moment before finally nodding. "I can do that," he said. "And I will." Unlike many promises made in corporate meetings, this one was immediate. Before the evening ended, Adrian instructed his team to establish a workforce assistance initiative that would provide educational grants and professional development opportunities for service employees within businesses partnered with his company. The proposal still required planning and approval, but the commitment was made that night. Emily thanked him and quietly returned to her responsibilities. By the time she left the restaurant after midnight, she assumed the evening would become nothing more than an unusual memory. She was wrong. The following morning, the merger agreement was finalized after the corrected provisions were incorporated into the document. What could have become a catastrophic legal dispute instead became one of the most successful transactions in the company's history. The lead attorney later admitted that the overlooked conflict would almost certainly have triggered years of expensive litigation. Within days, word of the incident spread throughout Adrian's organization. Not every detail became public, but enough people learned the story to ensure it would not be forgotten. Employees who had never met Emily spoke about the waitress who identified a flaw that multiple legal teams failed to catch. Board members repeated the story in meetings. Senior executives used it as an example of the dangers of assumption and overconfidence. For Adrian, however, the lesson was far more personal. A week after the merger closed, he returned to the restaurant. This time there were no investors, no attorneys, and no board members accompanying him. He requested a table in Emily's section and waited patiently until she approached. Before speaking with Emily, Adrian took a moment to thank the restaurant manager for his hospitality during the previous week. He then offered a brief apology in front of several staff members who had witnessed his behavior that night. The gesture was simple, but it surprised everyone who heard it. Adrian Cole was not known for admitting mistakes publicly. When she recognized him, she smiled politely. "Good evening, sir." Adrian smiled back. "Good evening, Emily." There was a brief pause before he continued. "I wanted to tell you something in person." Emily waited. "For years I believed success gave me the ability to evaluate people quickly," Adrian said. "I thought I could tell who was intelligent, capable, or valuable within a few minutes of meeting them. What happened that night forced me to realize how often confidence disguises ignorance. Adrian smiled faintly. A week ago, I joked that reading a menu might be difficult for you. Emily remembered the comment immediately. Adrian shook his head. It turns out you understood a billion-dollar contract better than the rest of us. Emily listened quietly. Adrian then placed an envelope on the table. This is not a reward. It is an opportunity. Inside was an offer from his company. The position was not symbolic. It was a genuine legal analyst role with mentorship, tuition assistance, and a pathway to complete the degree she had been forced to leave behind years earlier. Emily stared at the document for several seconds. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. Adrian answered without hesitation. Because talent should not be wasted simply because life became difficult. Emily looked down at the offer once more. For years she had convinced herself that chapter of her life was over. Now, unexpectedly, a door she thought had closed forever had reopened. As Adrian prepared to leave, he paused beside the table. Thank you for correcting the contract, he said. Emily smiled. You are welcome. Adrian shook his head slightly. No, thank you for correcting something far more important than the contract. He walked toward the exit, leaving Emily holding the envelope and contemplating a future she had almost abandoned. Sometimes the most expensive mistakes are not hidden inside legal documents. Sometimes they are hidden inside the assumptions people make about one another. And sometimes true brilliance is found in the very places powerful people never think to look.